Hey everyone, welcome to this explainer. Okay, so today we're literally putting on our senior examiner hats. We're going to tackle a really fascinating question. How exactly does contrasting economic development shape human vulnerability to volcanoes? To do this, we're putting two incredibly dynamic nations side by side. Japan, an advanced country, or AC, and Indonesia, an emerging and developing country, an EDC. We're going for a rigorous top-tier analysis here, so grab your notes because we are aiming for that A-star evaluation today. All right, let's dive into this. If you're following the OCR Hazardous Earth specification, specifically Section 4A, you'll know it absolutely demands this kind of comparative analysis. We need to look at case studies of two countries at contrasting economic levels to figure out why people live near volcanoes and the impacts they actually experience. So it's not just about memorizing dates and death tolls. It's about drawing those deep, synoptic comparisons, making those connections. Here's our examiner's rubric for the day. First, we'll cover tectonic foundations, then evaluating social impacts. Third, economic and political realities. Fourth, the environmental paradox. And finally, the final evaluation. Starting off with Section 1, tectonic foundations, looking at equivalence in natural threat. Now, before we could even begin to compare the human elements, the economies, the politics, we've got to prove that the natural tectonic threats are actually comparable, right? I mean, if one country just naturally has way bigger volcanoes, it wouldn't really be a fair test of economic development. But look at this. Both of these nations are sitting right on the ring of fire on highly active convergent plate boundaries. We're talking intense subduction zones. Japan has the Pacific plate subducting beneath the Eurasian and Philippine plates, while down in Indonesia, it's the Indo-Australian plate sliding under the Eurasian plate. And the numbers? They're staggeringly similar. Japan's got around 110 active volcanoes. Indonesia has over 130. They both face routine, frequent activity. Japan sees about 10 to 15 minor eruptions a year. Indonesia sees 15 to 20. So the baseline hazard is essentially equal. The real difference? That's all in the human response. So with the natural threat being pretty much equal, we see this massive spatial variation in vulnerability based purely on human factors. Think about it. Why do people choose to live in the shadow of these giants? Well, in Japan, our EAC, they leverage volcanoes for high-tech and luxury benefits. Think massive geothermal energy grids powering cities, or that specialized hot spring tourism, the famous onsens. Plus, they honestly just lack flat land. But then you look at Indonesia, our EDC, and the motivation is deeply tied to basic survival. They absolutely rely on those incredibly fertile volcanic soils for subsistence agriculture, growing things like rice and coffee. On top of that, poverty simply prevents a lot of people from relocating. Add in a lack of hazard knowledge or maybe some distrust in government science, and people end up staying right in the danger zones. Moving on to Section 2, evaluating social impacts. Let's look at the human toll. This is where we shift our focus to the direct human consequences. We need to evaluate just how effective each country's mitigation strategies actually are at protecting lives. Let's contrast two defining modern eruptions. Over in Japan, the 2014 eruption of Mount Ontake was this sudden, highly unpredictable phreatic eruption right at a popular ski resort. It tragically killed 63 people. But because of Japan's immense wealth and infrastructure, the impacts remained highly localized right there on the mountaintop. Now, flip over to Indonesia's 2010 Mount Merapi eruption. This wasn't localized at all. It was a massive systemic event. We're talking 353 deaths, 570 injured, and a staggering 360,000 people forced to evacuate. I mean, the sheer scale of that displacement perfectly highlights the contrasting capacity between an AC and an EDC to absorb a tectonic shock. But it is super important to note that Japan's current resilience, that's a product of intense economic development over time. They definitely haven't always been immune. Back in 1792, Mount Unzen erupted, collapsing a lava dome that triggered a massive tsunami, killing 14,500 people. It's really only today, through huge economic investments in strong evacuation systems and 24/7 monitoring, that their casualties are minimized. Conversely, Indonesia suffered historical catastrophes too, like the infamous 1883 Krakatoa eruption, which killed tens of thousands. The difference is that mass vulnerability still persists in Indonesia today, simply because the economic capacity for universal, high-tech mitigation just isn't quite there yet. All right, Section 3, economic and political realities, disruption versus destruction. So the crucial point here is how we actually frame the economic impact. As an examiner, you need to distinguish between a financial inconvenience and absolute systemic destruction. Get a load of this number, $600 million. That was the economic loss from flight disruptions alone during the 2010 Mount Merapi eruption. Volcanic ash doesn't respect borders, and it certainly doesn't respect bank accounts. The economic ripple effects of these events are absolutely massive. But how that economic hit is actually felt? Totally different. Japan's economic hits are mostly characterized by disruption. Ski resorts close down, hotels lose tourism revenue, flights get canceled. And sure, the government faces really high costs to maintain their defenses, but society bounces back quickly. In Indonesia, however, the economic hit is characterized by profound destruction. These eruptions destroy actual livelihoods. During Merapi, 130 million cubic meters of crops were just ruined, and 2,000 farm animals were killed. Wealth allows Japan to experience an eruption as a severe economic disruption, but in Indonesia, it literally wipes out the foundation of their survival. And naturally, this bleeds right into the political fallout. Looking impartially at our sources, we can observe how governance is tested entirely differently in these two nations. In Japan, the political response is highly bureaucratic. It's focused on policy. After ONTAK in 2014, the government reviewed and revised their evaluation protocols for volcano tourism, tightened up some warnings, and moved on. But in an EDC like Indonesia, the 2010 Merapi event caused severe governmental strain. There were major controversies surrounding evacuations, mostly because local populations sometimes trusted traditional beliefs over government science. Plus, Indonesia often has to rely on international aid and NGOs, like the UN, for recovery. And post-disaster resource allocation? That can sometimes lead to friction over housing and relief funds. The risk of political instability is tangibly higher. Next up, Section 4, the environmental paradox. Let's look at volcanoes as engines of both destruction and renewal. This right here is perhaps one of the most geographically compelling aspects of tectonic hazards. We call it the volcanic paradox. It's this wild phenomenon where devastating, short-term environmental impacts, I'm talking acid rain, ash totally smothering plants, total ecosystem destruction, eventually give way to profound long-term ecological benefits and incredibly high soil fertility. The story of Torishima Island in Japan is just incredible evidence of this paradox. A 1902 eruption there killed 150 people and literally wiped out every single mammal species on the island. Total devastation. But if you go there today, that abandoned island has become a thriving protected bird sanctuary. Nature just completely reclaimed it. Meanwhile, over in Indonesia, Merapi releases sulfur dioxide that causes pretty damaging acid rain in the short term, yet the volcanic ash it constantly dumps is the exact reason the soil can sustain the intense agriculture that feeds millions of people. And speaking of that ash, consider this absolutely staggering figure. 250 million tons. That is the amount of ash dumped by Indonesia's Mount Sinabung in a recent eruption phase. Now, why does that matter? Well, agricultural experts equate that 250 million tons of ash to roughly 10 million tons of high-grade agricultural fertilizer spread completely naturally across the landscape. It's literally an engine of renewal. Finally, Section 5, the final A-star evaluation. Time to synthesize our case studies. So it's time to pull together the core geographical lessons of AC versus EDC resilience. Synthesizing everything we've just evaluated, the dynamic becomes crystal clear. Japan's advanced technology and wealth allow for highly effective mitigation. But Indonesia's frequent eruptions cause much more severe social disruption while simultaneously sustaining their agriculture. It just perfectly balances the dual nature of the hazard. Basically, Japan buys resilience with capital. Indonesia endures the disruption because the volcano guarantees their agricultural survival. And that leaves me to leave you with this final provocative thought. While wealth clearly mitigates the immediate death toll in places like Japan, does the universal human need for the fertile soil that volcanoes produce mean that our broader human vulnerability to these forces of nature is ultimately inevitable? It's a hugely complex geographical reality, and I really hope this comparative analysis has given you the framework to understand it a bit more deeply. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.